The air in Syracuse had that distinct early September crispness, a promise of the brutal winter to come. But for Chloe and Mia, it felt like a fresh start. The promise was amplified by the sheer luck of their new home. They'd found a 2-bedroom house for rent that was well beyond their student budgets, but the landlord had offered them a deal that felt like a clerical error in their favor. They could have the cavernous basement apartment for a fraction of the main floor's rent. It was musty and shadowed, with stone walls that wept condensation, but it was spacious and, most importantly, cheap. The final piece of their good fortune slotted into place at an estate sale just a few blocks away. A somber affair at a house whose owner had recently passed. They wandered through rooms draped in white sheets, the air thick with the scent of mothballs and stale memories. The furniture was old, stately, and possessed a character that their Ike-filled dorm rooms had sorely lacked. They found an armchair with deep burgundy upholstery, worn smooth in all the right places. A dark mahogany vanity with a 3-paneled mirror that seemed to drink the light from the room. A heavy oak dining table, its surface a roadmap of nicks and scratches, each one hinting at a story. The prices were so low they felt like they were stealing. They paid in cash, a wad of bills that represented their summer job savings, and arranged for everything to be delivered that afternoon. Their excitement a palpable buzz between them. The movers, 2 burly men with sullen faces, grunted as they hauled the pieces down the narrow stairs into the basement. The armchair was the first to arrive. As Mia guided it into a corner, her hand resting on its cushioned back, a sudden violent pain shot through her chest. It was sharp and constricting, stealing her breath and making her vision swim. An inexplicable wave of pure animal terror washed over her, so potent it made her knees buckle. She stumbled back, gasping, clutching her sternum. Chloe rushed to her side, her face etched with concern. "Mia, what's wrong?" Mia shook her head, the sensation vanishing as quickly as it had arrived. "Nothing," she panted, forcing a weak smile. "Just pulled something," exhausted. Chloe, though worried, accepted the explanation. The day was long and physically demanding. Yet, a similar strangeness befell her a half-hour later. She was wiping down the vanity mirror, clearing away a film of dust when she caught her own reflection. For a split second, the face staring back wasn't hers. It was another woman, younger, with eyes hollowed out by a profound sadness, her mouth a perfect O of silent despair. A single phantom tear seemed to trace a path down. The glass before the image fractured, and her own wide-eyed, frightened face snapped back into focus. She flinched away from the mirror, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was a trick of the light, she told herself, a smudge on the old, imperfect glass dot by evening. The apartment was arranged. The furniture filled the space beautifully, lending it an air of Gothic elegance that almost made them forget they were living in a glorified cellar. The dark wood absorbed the weak light from the overhead bulbs, creating deep pools of shadow in every corner. Despite their pride in their new home, a certain heaviness began to settle in the air as the sun went down. The house above them was silent, the main floor tenants not yet moved in, leaving them in a profound subterranean quiet. It was a quiet that seemed to listen back. They ordered pizza and sat at the old oak table, trying to inject some normalcy into the increasingly eerie atmosphere. But their conversation was stilted, punctuated by sounds they couldn't place. A soft, sibilant whisper that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The distinct creak of a floorboard from the far side of the room where no one was standing. Each sound made them freeze, their eyes darting into the oppressive darkness that ringed their small island of light. They were just the groans of an old house, they reasoned. They were tired, their minds playing tricks on them after a stressful day. Later, sleep did not come easily. Chloe was plagued by fragmented nightmares of falling from a great height, the sensation of impact jarring her awake multiple times. Mia's dreams were of water, of being held down, the pressure on her chest immense and unyielding, her lungs burning for air she couldn't find. The faces of strangers flickered through there. Subconscious, men and women with eyes wide with panic and pain. They were the fleeting, disjointed narratives of unknown tragedies, leaving them exhausted and unnerved when morning finally broke. It was during the deepest point of the night, when the darkness of the basement felt absolute, that Mia's eyes snapped open. She wasn't sure what had woken her, but a primal sense of being watched prickled the back of her neck. She slowly turned her head, her gaze drawn to the corner of the room. The burgundy armchair was no longer empty. A figure was sitting there, a stooped, masculine silhouette hunched deep into the cushions, perfectly still. Mia's breath caught in her throat, a scream dying before it could form. She couldn't make out any features. The figure was a void, a shape carved out of the deeper shadows. It just sat there, exuding an aura of immense stillness and sorrow. She squeezed her eyes shut, her mind screaming, "It isn't real, it isn't real." She counted to 3, a frantic, silent prayer. When she opened them again, the chair was empty. There was nothing there but the worn burgundy fabric and the oppressive, silent dark, but the indentation in the cushion, as if someone had just risen from it, remained. She stared at it for what felt like an eternity, the chill in the room seeping deep into her bones. The bargain they had struck for this apartment and its beautiful, second-hand furniture suddenly felt like a terrible binding contract whose terms they were only just beginning to understand. The house was not just old, it was occupied. And the previous owners, it seemed, had never truly left their favorite seats. The days that followed were a slow, creeping descent into a shared madness, each piece of furniture a station in their torment. The initial fleeting oddities began to solidify, gaining a horrifying clarity and persistence. The basement was no longer just their apartment. It was a gallery of death, and they were the unwilling audience, forced to watch the same final, terrible moments on a continuous, soul-shredding loop. The bargain was beginning to show its hidden costs, payable in sanity and sleep. The burgundy armchair became Mia's personal hell. She started avoiding it, making wide arcs around the corner where it sat, but its presence was magnetic. Sometimes, walking past it, the crushing chest pain would return, a phantom hand squeezing the air from her lungs. Driven by a morbid curiosity, She couldn't explain. She eventually forced herself to sit in it again. The moment she sank into the cushions, the world dissolved. She wasn't in the basement anymore. She was in a small, sunlit parlor, her hands gnarled and liver-spotted. She felt a frantic, irregular heartbeat fluttering in her chest like a trapped bird. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the edges of her vision turning gray and fuzzy. She was having a heart attack, and she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The flash was over in seconds, leaving her gasping in the armchair, the echo of the old man's final ragged breath her own. Chloe, meanwhile, found her terror in the vanity mirror. It was no longer just a fleeting glimpse of another face. The SD woman was a near-constant companion. Her reflection would subtly alter when she wasn't paying close attention. She'd glance up from brushing her teeth to see her own eyes sunken and bruised, filled with a despair so profound it felt like drowning. One evening, as she leaned in to apply mascara, the reflection of the woman lunged forward, her silent scream fogging the glass, her spectral hands pressing against the other side of the mirror as if trying to break through. Chloe screamed and stumbled back, tripping over a rug. From the floor, she saw the fog on the mirror slowly clear. A single, perfect handprint left behind. A chilling five-fingered stain that remained for an hour before slowly fading from view. The oak dining table was a neutral ground of horror they could share. Studying there became impossible. The moment they both sat down, a dull throb would begin in their temples, escalating into a splitting headache. The polished wood, instead of reflecting the low-hanging light fixture, would show them other things. Ghostly imprints would swim to the surface, the afterimage of an overturned bottle of prescription pills, the spectral stain of spilled wine like a pool of blood, the faint, shimmering outlines of a family frozen in a moment of bitter, silent conflict. They felt the rage, the resentment, the crushing weight of unspoken grievances, the air growing thick with a familial poison that had steeped into the very grain of the wood. Their lives began to unravel. They were jumpy, sleep-deprived, and their conversations became a constant whispered litany of "Did you hear that?" and "Did you see that?" Their grades plummeted. Chloe stopped attending her morning lectures, unable to face her own reflection to get ready. Mia developed a nervous tic, constantly touching her chest as if to reassure herself her heart was still beating correctly. The cheap rent was no longer a comfort, it was a cage. The money they had saved was worthless against the psychological debt they were accumulating with every passing hour. They tried to fight back. They agreed to research the history of the house, hoping for a clue, a name, anything to anchor the haunting. But public records showed nothing more than a series of unremarkable owners. They tried to find the organizers of the estate sale, but the number on the flyer was disconnected. It was as if the furniture had simply materialized from a pocket of history that had no official record, its origins deliberately obscured. The lack of answers only fed their paranoia, making them feel even more isolated in their terror. The fear, instead of uniting them, began to drive a toxic wedge between them. Their nerves were so frayed that any small annoyance could escalate into a shouting match. Chloe accused Mia of being morbidly obsessed with the armchair, of giving into it. Mia fired back that Chloe was hysterical, that her fear of the vanity was irrational. Deep down, they were both terrified, but the constant, invasive emotions bleeding from the furniture were corrupting their own feelings. Chloe felt the woman in the mirror's sense of betrayal, and Mia felt the lonely, bitter resentment of the old man in the chair. Their attempts to reclaim their space grew more desperate. Chloe took a bedsheet and draped it over the vanity, a flimsy barrier against the spectral sorrow it housed. It helped, but now the covered mirror stood in the corner of her room like a shrouded tombstone, its presence somehow even more menacing. Mia, on the other hand, found herself drawn to the armchair. She would sit in it for hours, not in a trance, but in a state of hypervigilance, trying to understand the echo, to parse the man's final moments, as if solving the mystery of his death would somehow set her free. It was a form of self-torture, a repeated exposure to the trauma that left her pale and withdrawn. The haunting was evolving. It was no longer just a passive replay of past events. The echoes were becoming immersive, interactive. One night, Chloe, lying in bed, felt a suffocating pressure on her chest, the distinct sensation of pillows being pressed against her face. She thrashed and fought against an invisible assailant, the echo of a different death, one tied to the heavy wooden bed frame they had also bought. Mia, while dozing in the armchair, felt the man's final breath not as an echo, but as a genuine cessation of her own breathing, jolting her awake with the certainty that she had, for a moment, actually died. The final thread of their denial snapped one rainy afternoon. Chloe, in a fit of frustration and a desperate need to prove to herself that she was in control, tore the sheet from the vanity. She stared at her reflection, defiant. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, her features began to melt and reform. Her eyes widened into the sad woman's eyes. Her mouth stretched into the woman's silent scream. It was a perfect superimposition, a ghostly mask. And this time, it spoke. The reflection's lips moved, but the voice was inside Chloe's head. A cold, clear whisper that was not her own thought. It said, with chilling certainty, "He did this to me. He pushed me." The whisper from the mirror shattered the last vestiges of their sanity. It was no longer a haunting, it was an accusation. The echoes weren't just memories of death. They were violent legacies, and they were pointing fingers. The realization that these weren't just tragic accidents, but perhaps murders, poisonings, and betrayals, changed the nature of the fear. It was no longer a passive horror. It felt active, hungry, and malicious. The basement wasn't just a container for these echoes. It was a charger, making them stronger with each passing day. Their first and only rational thought was to escape. "We have to get it out," Chloe said, her voice trembling, her eyes still fixed on the vanity mirror where her own face had finally returned. All of it, tonight. They started with the armchair, the source of Mia's specific torment. They grabbed it from both sides, ready to haul it up the narrow stairs and dump it on the curb. But the chair wouldn't budge. It felt impossibly heavy, as if it were bolted to the concrete floor. They pulled harder, their muscles straining, their feet slipping on the damp stone dot as they heaved. The psychic backlash hit them like a physical blow. Mia was slammed with the full, undiluted agony of the heart attack, not a flash, but a sustained, crushing torment that sent her collapsing to her knees, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. Simultaneously, Chloe was blinded by a vision of a different room, a man's face, twisted in rage, screaming at her before a violent shove sent her stumbling backward. The combined psychic scream from the objects was overwhelming, a wave of pure agony and terror that forced them to let go, leaving them shaking and weeping on the cold floor dot. Every attempt to remove another piece was met with a similar, violent resistance. When they tried to dismantle the heavy wooden bed frame, Chloe was overcome with a terrifying, realistic sensation of asphyxiation, the feeling of a heavy weight on her chest and a hand clamped over her mouth. She clawed at her own throat, tasting the phantom dust of a pillow. When they tried to drag the dining table toward the door, they were both struck by such a blinding, debilitating migraine that they couldn't even stand, the echoes of a dozen bitter arguments screaming in their minds. The furniture was not just in the apartment, it was the apartment. It had rooted itself in the stone and shadows, and it refused to leave. Their world shrank to the four walls of the basement. The thought of leaving, even to go to class or buy groceries, filled them with a new kind of dread. The invasive emotions from the furniture had started to cling to them, bleeding into their own personalities. Mia walked with a slight stoop, a hand often pressed to her chest, a perpetual, dull ache her constant companion. Chloe was consumed by a deep, gnawing paranoia, the mirror's echo of betrayal making her suspicious of everyone, including Mia. She would watch her roommate with narrowed, distrustful eyes. The whispered accusation, "He pushed me," coiling in her thoughts. They became true prisoners, not by locks and bars, but by their own spiraling terror and the malevolent gravity of the objects that held them captive. The outside world, with its sunshine and mundane problems, felt like a distant, half-forgotten dream. Their reality was the damp air, the oppressive shadows, and the constant, looping symphony of death. The echoes, no longer content to stay within their respective vessels, began to bleed into one another, creating a horrifying new tapestry of suffering. Mia, sitting at the dining table, would suddenly see the bruised, weeping face from Chloe's vanity reflected in the wood grain. Chloe, lying in bed, would feel the sharp, constricting pain of the old man's heart attack. One night, while frantically searching the closet for blankets to ward off the supernatural chill that had become permanent, Mia's fingers brushed against a cardboard box tucked away in the back. It wasn't theirs. It was heavy with dust and neglect. Inside, they found a collection of old photographs, the kind people leave behind in a hurry. Their blood ran cold. There he was, the old man from the armchair, younger, smiling proudly next to his new purchase. And there she was, the sad young woman posing at her vanity, a forced smile on her lips that didn't reach her haunted eyes. There was the family, captured in a stiff, unhappy portrait around the oak dining table. They were real. They had lived and breathed, and in this very space, they had died. The pictures proved they weren't insane. But the validation brought no comfort, only a deeper horror. This had happened before. This was a pattern. They were not the first to be tormented by these echoes. The final photograph in the box confirmed their worst fears. It was a faded Polaroid, taken within the basement itself. It showed a young couple. Their faces gaunt, their eyes wide with the same terror that now lived in Chloe and Mia's own eyes. They stood huddled together in the center of the room, and surrounding them, like silent, predatory animals, was their furniture, the burgundy armchair, the mahogany vanity, the oak table, the heavy wooden bed. A sickening realization dawned on them. The furniture hadn't all come from the same estate sale. That was a lie. This was a collection. The landlord hadn't been clearing out a dead man's house. He had been curating a museum of horrors. The furniture was left behind, tenant after tenant, victim after victim, each one adding their own tragedy to the chorus. They hadn't found a bargain. They had been selected to be the next exhibits. They were living in a trap, and the landlord was the one who kept setting the bait that, as this horrifying truth settled over them. The single, bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered violently. It buzzed, a sound like an angry insect, and then went out. They were plunged into an absolute, disorienting darkness. The silence that followed was worse than any noise. It was a weighted, expectant silence, and then it was broken. The whispers, the sobs, the gasps, the choked-off screams from every corner of the room began to rise, not as individual sounds, but blending and harmonizing into a single, malevolent, all-encompassing chorus that was coming for them. In the suffocating, pitch-black dark, the last fragile barriers between their minds and the spectral echoes shattered completely. The darkness was not empty. It was thick and teeming with the collected misery of the room. The chorus of whispers grew into a cacophony, a psychic storm that ripped through them, not just showing them the final moments of others, but forcing them to wear the deaths like their own skin. They were no longer Chloe and Mia. They were vessels, their identities scoured out to make room for the agony that had saturated the apartment for decades. Chloe, stumbling blindly, felt the phantom sensation of a hard shove from behind. The floor rushed up to meet her, and a blinding starburst of pain exploded at the back of her skull, just as the woman from the mirror must have felt. The words "he did this to me, he pushed me" were no longer a whisper from an external source. They were her own thought, a primal, absolute certainty. Her terror-stricken mind, desperately seeking a culprit in the dark, latched onto the only other presence, Mia. Mia had pushed her. The paranoia from the mirror fused with the violence of the fall, creating a new, terrifying delusion. At that same moment, Mia was fully and finally consumed by the armchair's echo. The phantom chest pains became brutally real, a searing, crushing agony that brought her to her knees. Her heart hammered in a chaotic, failing rhythm. She gasped for air that wouldn't come, her vision tunneling into a pinpoint of gray light, just as the old man's had. Through that tunnel, she saw a shape moving in the darkness, Chloe. In the haze of her own death throes, her oxygen-starved brain identified the shape not as her friend, but as the source of her torment, a threat that had to be fought. The apartment became a horrific stage, and the final tragedies were being reenacted with a new cast. Fueled by the mirror's narrative of betrayal and violence, Chloe scrambled to her feet and lunged toward the sound of Mia's gasping. Driven by the heart attack's agony and the primal fear of death, Mia met her with a desperate, flailing strength. It was a grotesque pantomime of violence, a chaotic clash in the dark where each woman was fighting not her roommate, but the ghost that possessed her. Chloe felt the suffocating pressure from the bed frame's echo. Mia felt the searing pain of poison from the dining table's legacy. Their individual screams merged into the room's dreadful chorus. Their struggle was a frantic, clumsy, and ultimately brief explosion of terror. It ended with a sickening thud, followed by a final, shared exhalation of breath. Then silence. A profound, empty silence that swallowed the echoes, the whispers, and the pain. For a long time, the basement was just a dark, quiet room once more. Still and waiting. The lock on the basement apartment's door clicked open, spilling a clean, bright rectangle of daylight down the stairs. The landlord, a cheerful, balding man with a kind smile, stepped inside, holding the door for a young student, a girl with a backpack slung over her shoulder and a hopeful expression on her face. He flicked a switch, and the overhead bulb buzzed to life, illuminating the room. It was completely empty. There was no armchair, no vanity, no table, no bed. The concrete floor was bare, scrubbed clean. There was no sign of Chloe or Mia. "It's a real bargain," the landlord said, his voice echoing slightly in the vacant space. The previous tenants, two lovely girls, had to transfer schools. Very sudden. They left in such a hurry, you know how it is. Said I could keep their security deposit if I handled their furniture. He gestured expansively at the empty room. "Gorgeous stuff, antique. I've got it in storage. For a couple $100, it's all yours. A real steal, and saves you the trouble of moving." The student's eyes lit up. The rent was already unbelievably low, and furnished on top of that. It felt like winning the lottery. "Wow, really? That's amazing," she said, walking into the center of the room. "I'll take it. I knew you would," the landlord beamed. "I'll have it all moved in for you tomorrow. You just get settled." He gave her a final fatherly nod before turning and heading back up the stairs, closing the door behind him and leaving the student alone in her new home. She stood in the middle of the empty basement, imagining where everything would go. A desk over there, a bed against that wall. The antique armchair the landlord mentioned would be perfect for the corner. As she stood there, dreaming of her future, a sudden sharp pain bloomed in her chest, so unexpected it made her gasp. An image, fleeting as a camera flash, seared across her vision. The face of a terrified young woman with wide, frantic eyes. Just as quickly it was gone. She shook her head, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "Just stress," she whispered to the empty room, already dismissing the feeling. She didn't know the true nature of the bargain she had just made. The landlord wasn't a liar. The furniture was in storage, but it was a storage space only he could access. The house didn't collect objects. It collected their owners. It consumed their final terrified moments, binding their souls to the objects they cherished or feared in life. The real bargain wasn't the cheap furniture. It was the fresh souls provided to feed the collection. In a place unseen, the burgundy armchair now held the echo of a new death, a frantic, messy struggle in the dark. The mahogany vanity now reflected a new face of terror. Chloe and Mia were not gone. They had simply become the latest acquisitions, their essences now steeping into the wood and fabric, waiting patiently for the landlord to bring their furniture home for the next move-in. The haunt had been renewed,